Welcome to Incentives Matter, your guide to what's new in behavioral science and behavioral economics. Let's see what's really driving decisions. Imagine a scenario. It's 3 a.m., an oil rig in the middle of the ocean. A critical safety alarm is blaring, but instead of responding, the crew disables it. Not because the danger is gone, but because they didn't want people woken up by false alarms. It sounds utterly insane, doesn't it? But that's exactly what was reported on the Deepwater Horizon rig before that catastrophic explosion in 2010. And it perfectly encapsulates this fundamental, almost baffling human flaw that a new NBER paper brings to light: our completely distorted perception of warning signals. So it's not just about ignoring an alarm because you're tired, but something deeper, something in how we inherently value or misvalue the very information meant to keep us safe. Precisely. It turns out we're hardwired to make some incredibly poor choices about what makes a good warning, and the consequences range from annoying to truly deadly. Okay, this is fascinating. Let's dig into this NBR working paper. Preferences for Warning Signal Quality, Experimental Evidence by Ugarov, Gadu, and McGee. They're asking a question that seems so simple on the surface. How much do people actually value the accuracy of a warning signal? But the implications, as you just hinted, are anything but. Right, and it's a question that defines modern safety. Think about it. Every alarm, every notification, every medical test, it's all about balancing false positives against false negatives. How often does the alarm go off when there's no danger versus how often does it stay silent when there is danger? These aren't abstract concepts. They're the difference between a minor annoyance and, well, a burning oil rig. The researchers really tried to isolate the core cognitive issue here, setting up a rigorous experiment at the Behavioral Business Research Lab. They gave 105 subjects a baseline probability of an adverse event occurring, a known prior, and then offered them warning signals with varying, clearly stated rates of false positives and false negatives. And importantly, they weren't just measuring how good people were at math or how generally fearful they were. They controlled for that. They used separate tasks to measure each subject's baseline risk preference and their Bayesian updating skill, essentially their raw ability to calculate how probabilities change when new information comes in. So we can't just blame bad math. So they're really trying to get to the heart of what our brain does when confronted with information that has potential errors. And for me, as someone who looks at how this plays out in the wild, a signal isn't just a physical siren. It's that push notification from your banking app about possible fraud. It's the check engine light on your dashboard. It's a mammogram or a PSA test for prostate cancer. Every single one of those requires someone to set a threshold for when that alarm triggers. Exactly, and that threshold is a behavioral design choice. If you set it low, meaning the system is super sensitive, you reduce missed threats, false negatives, but you unleash a flood of false alarms. If you set it high, you get fewer false alarms, but you risk missing actual dangers. It's a constant trade-off, and these researchers found we're terrible at understanding that trade-off. To truly appreciate how wild these findings are, we first need to understand what a perfectly rational actor should do. In traditional economics, the value of information is all about how much an alert improves the expected outcome. A rational, risk-neutral person should perfectly calculate the cost of a false alarm versus a missed threat, and their willingness to pay for that signal should scale perfectly with its quality. Which means if an event is incredibly rare, a rational person knows that almost every alarm is going to be a false positive. So they should heavily penalize, paying much, much less for, a system with a high false positive rate. Conversely, if an event is super common, the real danger is missing it. So you should heavily penalize a system with a high false negative rate. That's the textbook rational approach. And the NBER paper's data completely shatters that rational model. They found something they call asymmetric under-responsiveness by prior. That's a mouthful, but it means our reaction to signal quality is all over the map, depending on how common or rare the threat is. It's astonishing. When the threat was rare, subjects did not lower their willingness to pay enough to account for the high cost of false positives. They just overvalued inaccurate signals.
They ignored the mathematical reality that a rare event, paired with even a moderate false positive rate, guarantees a barrage of useless, costly false alarms. So even if the math was right in front of them, they just couldn't internalize it? Right. And it went the other way, too. When the threat was common, subjects did reduce their demand for signals with high false negative rates for rare events, but they failed to properly penalize the system for false negatives when the event was frequent. They just didn't react proportionally to the degradation of the information. As the paper points out, this aligns with other behavioral economics research that shows we consistently overvalue inaccurate signals.
Okay, so if it's not simply people are bad at math because the researchers controlled for Bayesian updating skills, and it's not just that people are super risk averse because they controlled for that too, then what is going on? What's the underlying cognitive glitch?
That's the real gem of this paper. They conclude that our brains default to a deeply ingrained, flawed cognitive shortcut, a decision-making heuristic where we simply do not distinguish between false positive and false negative errors.
You mean an error is just an error?
Exactly. To the human brain, an error is an error. The mind treats the probabilistic cost of a false alarm as cognitively equivalent to the probabilistic cost of a missed threat. It completely ignores the base rate of the event and the vastly different real-world consequences of those two types of failures.
That's absurd when you think about it. So my brain is basically telling me that the annoyance of my car alarm going off when a cat brushes against it is as bad as my smoke detector failing to go off when my house is on fire? The cost feels the same to my brain? Cognitively, yes. It's a shocking simplification. And because we weigh these arrows equally, we wildly misprice the value of warnings. We demand systems that are highly sensitive to rare threats, completely blind to the fact that we're signing ourselves up for a barrage of false positives that will eventually render the system useless. This isn't just an academic curiosity then. This error is error heuristic has massive real-world fallout, like in healthcare, for example, which is rife with these kinds of paradoxes.
Absolutely. The false positive paradox, specifically. It perfectly explains why patients constantly demand medical screenings for extremely rare diseases, completely ignoring the high likelihood and emotional cost of false positive. Let's walk through it. Imagine a rare disease that affects, say, 1 in 100,000 people. Okay, very rare. Now, a new medical test comes out. It's 99.9% accurate, it has a 0% false negative rate, it catches every single case, and it only has a 0.1% false positive rate. To the average patient relying on the error is error heuristic, that sounds like an incredible, highly valuable signal. They will pay a high premium for it.
99.9% accurate, 0.1 false positive? That sounds like a dream test, right?
But here's the reality. If you test 100,000 random people, the test will correctly identify the one person who has the disease. But because of that 0.1% false positive rate, it will also incorrectly flag 100 healthy people as having the disease.
Wait, so out of 100,000 people, it finds one sick person and 100 healthy people it says are sick?
Precisely. So if you get a positive result on that test, you're one of 101 people who tested positive, and only one of you actually has the disease. Your actual chance of having the disease if you get a positive result is less than 1%. It's a statistical trap.
That's mind-blowing. People get told they have a rare, potentially deadly disease, go through biopsies, anxiety, further tests, all because of a mathematically high likelihood of it being a false alarm?
Exactly. And because we cannot intuitively process this false positive paradox, and because we view errors as errors, regardless of the base rate, we over-demand these low-probability medical screenings. This leads to millions of dollars wasted, profound patient anxiety, and systemic medical waste.
This leads us directly to the crisis of alarm fatigue, which I know is a huge problem in hospitals. When we demand systems with low false negative rates, we want to catch every possible threat. Engineers respond by lowering the threshold for the alarm. And then, inevitably,
the alarms start going off constantly. In hospital ICUs, patients are hooked up to cardiac monitors that are incredibly sensitive but have low specificity. A study at UCSF found nurses were exposed to nearly 190 audible alarms per fay per patient. In some units, nurses hear over 100 alarms an hour. 190 alarms per patient per day? That's just noise. And the research shows that the vast majority of these rhythm alarms, sometimes up to 90%, are false positives. They're triggered by patients sweating or squirming or an ECG electrode losing contact with the skin. It's not a real danger. So nurses are spending a huge chunk of their day just responding to non-threats. A massive amount. Responding to non-actionable alarms consumes 10% or more of nursing time. That's essentially 10% of nursing wages spent chasing false positives. And the human cost is fatal. The ECRI Institute consistently identifies alarm fatigue as a top healthcare technology hazard. When the cacophony becomes background noise, nurses inevitably tune out, turn down, or even turn off the alarms, leading to tragic cases where a true, life-threatening event is missed.
And this isn't just a hospital problem, right? We see this in cybersecurity, in finance.
Everywhere. In cybersecurity, software is notoriously tuned to flag any anomalous behavior, which leads to IT professionals drowning in alert overwhelm. In finance, retail investors set up stock market alerts only to ignore them when the market becomes volatile and the alerts become ubiquitous. And the critical takeaway here is that transparency doesn't fix the problem.
Wait, really? You're saying if a company tells me, hey, this fraud alert system has a 1% false positive rate, that doesn't help me?
It doesn't, because of the error is error cognitive blind spot. You read 1% error and you fail to multiply it by the base rate. You fundamentally misjudge the value of that transparent information. So the transparency, while well-intentioned, ends up being useless from a decision-making perspective.
So if humans are predictably irrational and mathematically blind to these asymmetric costs, how do we fix the systems we rely on? What's the actionable takeaway for product designers, for policymakers, for choice architects?
The NBER paper's findings strongly suggest that choice architects need to be far more paternalistic when designing warning systems. Relying on user preference to set alarm thresholds is dangerous because user preference is demonstrably flawed. If you ask a user what they want, they will demand a system that catches everything, inadvertently signing themselves for alarm fatigue.
So we shouldn't ask users what they want? That feels counterintuitive to good design.
Not entirely, but designers must take the burden of Bayesian updating away from the user. Instead of expecting users to weigh the costs of false positives against false negatives, the system designer has to mathematically optimize that threshold based on the actual real-world consequences of those errors, even if that means the system occasionally misses a low-level threat. That means if designers do need to communicate error rates to users, they can't use raw percentages like we just discussed. They have to translate those statistical likelihoods into something tangible.
Exactly. To bypass the error is error heuristic, you need to use natural frequencies and specific, concrete costs. So a bad design would be, this fraud alert system has a 99% accuracy rate and a 1% false positive rate. Your brain thinks, great, I'll turn that on.
And the good design?
A good design would be, because fraud is very rare, if you turn on this maximum security setting, you will receive roughly 50 alerts this year. 49 of them will be false alarms that will temporarily freeze your credit card. Are you sure you want this setting?
Whoa, that's a completely different proposition. My brain now immediately understands the actual painful cost of those false positives.
It forces your brain to actually weigh the asymmetric cost of the false positive, bypassing that flawed heuristic entirely. It's about translating abstract probability into concrete, experienced consequence.
And in high-stakes environments like hospitals, this also means systemic workflow redesign. It's not just about the numbers, but how the alerts are delivered.
Yes, solutions include adjusting the sensitivity of devices so alarms only trigger when a highly specific danger threshold is reached, drastically reducing nuisance alarms. Consolidating redundant alerts is crucial. Instead of multiple devices screaming about the same thing, systems should escalate only when multiple data points corroborate a threat. and even implementing slight delays before sounding an alarm, giving the patient's vitals a moment to self-correct before screaming for a nurse.
This NBER paper truly is a perfect encapsulation of behavioral economics in the 2020s. It goes beyond just saying humans are biased and gives us specific, mathematically modeled evidence of how our cognitive machinery misfires in the modern information age.
It highlights that gap between the rational economic models we often build our systems upon and the messy, predictably irrational brains we actually possess. The error is error heuristic is a powerful insight into why we get so much wrong.
So, thinking about the future, especially with AI coming into play, as AI takes over signal generation, reading medical scans, predicting supply chain disruptions, will it just exacerbate this false positive paradox by detecting even smaller anomalies? Or can AI be trained to be that paternalistic choice architect, filtering out the noise and only presenting humans with signals that truly have a high expected utility?
That's the million-dollar question. And then there's the legal side. The biggest barrier to fixing alarm fatigue, for instance, is legal liability. Hospitals and tech companies err on the side of false positives because a missed threat, a false negative, results in a lawsuit, whereas 1,000 false positives just result in an annoyed, burned-out workforce. How do we align those legal incentives with human cognitive limitations?
Rational economic models wish we were calculators, but as the error is error heuristic proves, we are not. We are biological creatures easily overwhelmed by noise.
If we want to build a safer, more efficient world, we simply have to stop designing warning signals for the perfectly rational actor and start designing them for the easily fatigued, statistically blind human beings we actually are.
That's all for this episode of Incentives Matter. Join us next time as we keep unpacking what really drives decisions. Thanks for listening. Choose wisely, or at least know why you didn't.